Well, you may know that peace was reached in Ethiopia in an agreement that hasn't really gone quite so smoothly. You may recall at the time that we had independent journalist Hermela Aregawi on to discuss these talks, the peace talks as well as the peace agreements back in November. And she was kind enough to join us again today. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Natalie, for having me.
Now, when we last spoke, you laid out how the West, including the United States, was arming the region of Tigray while calling them the victims, saying they couldn't receive aid. And you disagreed with that narrative. Can you sort of sum it up again for anyone who missed that so we can have some context to bring you so that you can bring us up to speed?
Sure, I would say the U.S. was diplomatically arming the rebel group in the northern region. We don't have solid evidence that they were actually providing weapons to them, but the head of the World Health Organization, who is an executive member of the rebels in the northern region, has been accused of siphoning off what's supposed to be humanitarian aid for civilians to the rebel fighters. So in that way, there's some complicity in providing weapons for the rebels in the north. There was a peace deal signed, as you mentioned, last month. It's moving slow, but there doesn't seem to be an active war. And so a lot of people believe that the federal government of Ethiopia had leverage over the rebels, and that is why they came to the table, were flown out of the northern Ethiopian region of Tigray on U.S. military planes and sat down at the negotiation table and eventually signed what appeared to be a peace deal. There was a follow-up implementation agreement in Nairobi that added some preconditions that many Ethiopians and Eritreans were not happy with. Those preconditions being for the rebels to disarm, which was a part of the original agreement, that Eritrean forces from the neighboring country and other regional forces had to leave the region. But what we know at this point is the TPLF leadership has said about 65% of their fighters have disengaged. I haven't been able to cross-reference that with the Ethiopian government, but there appears to be a move towards disengagement with the goal being disarmament of the rebels. But there's also indications that some of them might be regrouping and trying to rearm, but at this stage, Ethiopians and Eritreans are still hopeful that the deal will, but it's definitely past the original deadline of 30 days of full disarmament that was agreed to in Pretoria, South Africa.
I mean, you wonder how that works. Do they just set out a box and people just like, okay, these guns, here you can have them? It
Right.
takes a lot of faith.
Right. To be honest with you, the initial 30-day agreement seemed way too ambitious because as is in some of the agreement, what they have to do is the leadership on the rebel side, which was a regime that was in power for 27 years. So these aren't just, a ragtag group in a sense. They have a lot of support or had a lot of support, and they lost a lot of their armament and their fighters, is they had to go back and basically re-educate them. They had been telling them for 2 years that the entire country of Ethiopia is trying to wipe your ethnicity out, and that's why
Yeah.
you need to pick up your arms. So they have to undo that conditioning that made mothers send 5 of their children to fight this war because they were told it's a matter of, existing or not existing. And now they realize a lot of that was propaganda. So, I have some empathy for some of these people that have been recruited to fight because they did not have much exposure to the rest of the world or any other narrative. And they were under the gun in a sense, many of them forcefully recruited. So first you have to give them a reason to disarm, which goes against everything rebel leadership in the North had been telling them for years. So 30 days did seem quick, but definitely I think most of the region agrees that for the country, for Ethiopia to have peace, there has to be only one national defense forces, and you cannot have a competing armed group in the country. And so that is, I don't think Ethiopians or Eritreans will settle for anything less than that eventually.
Yeah. Now, but the rhetoric around conflict there is still strong in the United States. In fact, recently, U.S. Congressman Brad Sherman asked the Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, to sanction Ethiopia Airlines because he's still not happy with the state of the peace treaty. And he says there's still not aid into the Tigray region. But you had said when we spoke months ago or weeks ago rather, that the aid was reaching the Tigray region just fine.
Absolutely. So Congressman Brad Sherman, who just so happens to be the congressman to the district in California that I live in, has some sort of a stake in this that is still not explained. I mean, from journalist to journalist, I wish somebody would have the time and capacity to be able to really investigate it. Some people have said it's because there are, rebel sympathizers and supporters in the US that contribute to his campaign. But when you look at what's publicly available, it just doesn't add up. It might be about $50,000 they're contributing from across the country. And that doesn't really explain why he's so committed to supporting the rebel leadership in the north. So what he's talking about, the reason for withholding a loan from the Ethiopian Airlines, which is a state-operated entity, one of the best operated entities in Ethiopia, one of the best airlines in Africa, and internationally competitive. What he's saying that they're wrong for doing is allegedly transporting arms during a time of war. There have been experts that said there is nothing illegal about that. It is as state airlines during a time of crisis, it has the capacity and the legality to be able to transport any arms. But Ethiopian Airlines has actually denied doing that. So it's really unclear. But even still, they didn't do anything illegal. So to punish the country, in a sense, something that is not really out of the ordinary doesn't make sense, and it essentially punishes the ordinary people. AGOA, which is a trade bill that Ethiopia has been removed from as a punishment for fighting these rebels in the country, is also costing thousands of jobs in the country. So these kind of moves actually hurt ordinary Ethiopians, and they don't have much ground to stand on in terms of why they're actually pushing these kind of sanctions bills against the country.
Yeah, that's too bad. Sanctions that hurt people who are not responsible for this. I want to circle back to the head of the World Health Organization. Can you say his name? I'm sure you, Tedros.
Sure, Tedros Adhanom. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so last week he said,
he goes by.
What does he go by?
Dr. Tedros. You can call him Dr. Tedros.
Okay. Last week he said that his uncle was killed by Eritrean troops in the region. What is this indicative of? Is there proof that this was from an Eritrean army or from Ethiopian troops from the Amara region? Can you speak to that?
Sure. He was asked by journalists to provide some sort of proof, name, the town in which this has happened. And he said, I can't do that because it's going to put the people in that area in danger. These kind of claims, I don't doubt. Obviously, there have been people killed in that region, and some of them are people's families that live outside of that region. But Dr. Tedros is known for using these vague, claims of atrocities in order to advance his political agenda, which, again, he is an executive member of this rebel group that has been fighting the country and the neighboring Eritrea for 2 years. So it's not a leap to say that what he's doing is in favor of those rebels as opposed to the people. So he says an uncle, I think he's previously said a cousin. People do this all the time in advocacy. They make these claims and then they give you reasons as to why they can't provide evidence. Now, the average person, it may make sense for them to say, oh, I don't want them to be threatened, or I don't want, people that threatened. But Dr. Tedros, the head of the World Health Organization, he's made claims that he can't send money back to his family as well. And these kind of accusations or claims are not believable when you're at that height of power. He can get money wherever he wants in that region. Now, the other issue is some of the rebels control parts of that region. Mm-hmm. So in the parts control, which is about 30%, maybe less, we're not sure what is happening. The Ethiopian government claims there are crimes being committed in the regions where it's not in control. Don't have evidence of that one way or the other. Although I will say in the capital region of Mekelle, which is the capital city where there's some services and telecom that's being reinstated, there's been a lot of looting and crimes. And the looting and crime, many of which happens to be local. It would have to be local because the federal government is not in control of that region yet, and the Eritrean forces. So those are the kind of, pieces that we can put together based on how much access is had. But the kind of claims that Dr. Tedros are making, you don't want to say nothing happened to your family member. But then as someone in his position, in order to make that sort of claim, really should provide some evidence.
Right, especially if he is providing an accusation of a group at a time when peace is precarious.
Absolutely. It's such a sensitive time. We want there to be peace. We want all this 2 years of accusations, many of them baseless, to be behind us and the country to move forward. What there is evidence of, though, is Dr. Tedros actually orchestrating humanitarian aid for it to go to the rebels that were fighting their countrymen
Hmm.
and their country. So, I mean, there's way more evidence for that than the claims that he's making. But we all want peace, so that nobody is getting hurt in the context of this war, including anyone that's his family member.
Right. Okay. Now, on the subject of accusations, can you speak to the Meta lawsuit now that was filed in Kenya by two Ethiopian researchers who say that Facebook's recommendation system amplified violent posts in Ethiopia, including several that preceded the murder of the father of one of the litigants? Can you comment on this at all?
Right. I'm taking a look at the case a little bit, just, on the surface, looking at it, it accuses, Facebook of being responsible for 500,000 Ethiopians that were killed during the Tigray war. I mean, there are ways in which, Facebook and Twitter are complicit. It seems to me in this lawsuit, it's pointing the finger in the wrong direction, because you could make the case that the fact that this Tigray genocide narrative ran amok for so long without evidence actually incites violence. So when you tell a people that there's a genocide against you, the human reaction will be violence, right?
Yes.
Because it's a matter of I exist or you exist if you believe that narrative. So in that way, I think Facebook and Twitter really failed. But to say that, by not silencing more Ethiopians and Eritreans, which were silenced on Twitter as part of the No More Global movement that was in response
Oh,
to,
yes. Yeah.
yeah, the Tigray genocide narrative that was, going on for a year. I mean, the problem is with these institutions, and I know folks that work at, both Facebook and Twitter, they are not, if you want to give them the benefit of the doubt, they're not culturally competent, right? So they don't have enough people
Yes.
in house that can translate properly, that can give them context. If they did, they're likely to get it more right. And then a lot of the times what happens is they have people in house that are kind of on the propaganda side of things, and they can make their case. And I know for a fact in terms of Twitter, there are people within that were incredibly biased on this war, but they were Ethiopians. Some of them were from the Tigray region, so their voices were amplified.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, maybe it's because they just, don't know how to do better. And then in other ways, it does seem like they're influenced by, some of the government talking points as well.
Yeah, that's giving them that's generously giving them the benefit of the
Right.
doubt, in my opinion, especially in light of all the Twitter files we've seen recently. I have just one more question. I was hoping you could give us a temperature on the African summit that happened in Washington, D.C. last week. President Biden made it clear that Africa is a priority. He announced trade agreements. I'm curious if this is the U.S. attempt to make sure that China and Russia can't get in these regions, or that's sort of usually my assumption, what I'm looking for. So I don't want to lead the question,
Right.
but maybe you can just tell me a little bit about it, even though I have led the
Sure.
question. Sorry.
Well, so let's base it even on that premise. I mean, even based on that premise, they're failing. So if their goal is to compete with China and Russia on the continent, they're not competing very well. Let's look at some of what came out of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. Biden talked about committing $55 billion to the continent over the course of 3 years. When you break that down, that's less than $20 billion a year to a continent with a population of more than 1.2 billion. And so
Wow, that's
why is
really small, especially when you see the Ukraine
it's
aid.
nothing?
Yeah.
Thank you. It's nothing. I mean, they're not serious. The U.S. is not serious about mending their relationship and advancing their relationship with Africa. I mean, like you mentioned, how much are they giving to Ukraine? They're giving more than $60 billion in 1 year to Ukraine. And you're talking about $55 billion over the course of 3 years for a continent that has 30 times more the population and is incredibly underdeveloped. It's resource rich, but it's incredibly underdeveloped. And at this point, the right to this basic level of economic development on the continent is really a human rights issue. So you see people like the California Congressman Brad Sherman, pretending to care about certain type of human rights. What about the right to basic economic development? What about the right for women to be able to go to work and feed their kids, for them to have clean water, for them to have some level of food security? This is the way in which we need to change the way we talk about human rights, particularly those of us here in the West, including the United States. We pick and choose. We talk about, and this was discussed in the forum, the community forum that we had in DC ahead of the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit. The U.S. always wants to talk about civil and political rights, elections, and the way that they see elections should be done. But there are other basic rights that are just as important, like the right to water, the right to food, the right to, basic, decent living conditions. And the African diaspora, people that are from the continent, that have family on the continent, actually send way more in 1 year in remittances than the U.S. has committed in 3 years. So it looks like a bunch of PR. As an American, in some ways, I'm rooting for the U.S. to get this right. But each time, it just seems like they're doing the absolute minimum and then just hoping that it'll fix itself. I mean, there are places in Africa that are so critical to the U.S. If you look at the Democratic Republic of Congo, it is 70% of the cobalt in the world comes from there. And then I think a lot of the rest comes from China, right? So if something was to happen to the Congo, it would be an economic disaster in so many ways in many parts of the U.S. or the continent or the world, especially the U.S., right? And I was at one of the events at the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit where a man from the DRC asked one of the Congress people, what are you going to do about the Congo? I mean, you guys have to fix the way that you are working with the Congo. There is a way, for you to be able to get the things you need and then actually help that country
develop a nation. Yeah.
Just a little bit. I mean, it's in constant conflict while there's all this looting that's happening of its resources. And so it's really about changing the partnership, making it on more equal grounds, understanding that the U.S. needs Africa. It genuinely actually needs Africa in terms of the resources. And so I would like to see the U.S. approaching this differently, because there's a lot of young people on the continent that are watching the way that the U.S. is operating, and it's either going to push them closer to the U.S. or further away from the U.S. and other powers like China and Russia that we know the U.S. wants to be able to compete against. So it's just a natural next step to reform the U.S.-Africa relationship. I mean, this was the second summit in 8 years, the U.S. Africa summit. And yet on the backside of it, what do we see? This chump change that's thrown at the continent as a whole. And even within that, there are conditions. So what you saw, the $100 million that the Congressman Brad Sherman was trying to stipulate, that comes from that $55 billion. So you've got 20 billion, less than 20 billion a year. Within that, you're conditioning it based on what you believe are human rights issues and ignoring what the country believes are human rights issues. And then there's also a report actually that came out recently from the UN Economic Commission for Africa this year that said there's about $84 billion in illicit financial flows annually that go into Africa. So what that means is whatever money that goes in is often leaving the continent through these illicit ways. And much of that involves corporations and government officials, both local to the African continent and those that are here in the West. So whatever money is going in is not actually ending up developing the continent as well. So when you add all that up, what's left?
Yeah.
Right? So that's it feels like nothing because of all the ways that it disappears before it reaches the people on the ground.
Well, in that way, it feels like the summit was a bit of an action item, But I appreciate the context very much, because, you see the headlines splashed about like, yay, look, the United States really wants to expand into this region. And so, it seems like it may not be all that serious of an intention. And then when you juxtapose it with the Zelensky visit this week, you can see where they're serious. So thank you for providing that context. It's always a pleasure to talk to you to help break down these headlines, because I want to be more culturally competent too. So thank you for your time. It's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you, Natalie. My pleasure.